So recently I ended up playing this game called Frogmonster. At first it was really exciting, but now that I've put a significant amount of time into it, my feelings are a little bit mixed. First, I think that this developer genuinely deserves praise for coming up with so many unique boss mechanics while being a solo developer. There's like 32 bosses in the game, and I didn't come across a single one that reused a similar mechanic. In a perfect world, this game would get enough recognition that the developer would get hired by a AAA studio. Because if we got bosses of this caliber and quality in our AAA games, the world would be a better place. But where the game falls flat for me is with everything else. Exploration is sprawling and confusing. The further you get in the game, the more pathways you'll open up that you can explore, and they just kind of keep going and going and going. This would be really cool if the game wasn't playing pretend at being more open-ended and less linear. There are areas you will go to where enemies will destroy you if you haven't got the right upgrades yet. Like, imagine there's a fork in the road and you go down the path on the right, but clearly the area is designed in such a way that it expects you to have completed the path on the left first. Like, it's cool that it gives you the option, but I personally would prefer if it's linear, because I feel like I'm just wasting my time going to the path on the right first. It doesn't help that pretty much everything in this game is a corridor, and despite the beautiful voxel graphics, I would get lost very easily at how repetitious some of these areas looked. I also have a bit of a problem with the game advertising itself as a Metroidvania, because it's not a Metroidvania. It's a Metroid game. The distinct difference between the two categories is in a Metroid game, you're locked behind boss progression for upgrades, whereas in a Metroidvania, killing even the smallest of enemies will grant you experience points, which allows you to almost force your way through the game through sheer stats alone. Now, there is some form of progression that is more similar to a game like Hollow Knight, where you have these bugs that you can catch that will basically give you different passive abilities, but you have a limited amount of slots that you can use them on. In a way, this is the encouragement to grind enemies, because you could end up grinding currency to upgrade those slots. But for whatever reason, I just don't find that as interesting as grinding XP. While we're on the subject of the combat, I was really surprised to see how little it evolved. Even with multiple gun upgrades and new weapons that I was acquiring constantly, I was a little bit disappointed that enemies were basically bullet sponges. Like, really early on in the game, they kind of teach you to shoot weak points on enemies, which was a really exciting idea that I was hoping the game would explore as I got further along, but it didn't. Enemies are just kind of really spongy. I didn't feel like I was purposefully switching weapons to defeat specific enemies. It was more so, which guns did I have ammo with? But despite these criticisms, would I still recommend Frogmonster? Yes, I would. Simply because a game like this deserves success. While this review might have seemed negative in its tone, I more so wanted to focus and pick apart the issues that I had with my overall experience, but in no way, shape, or form does that take away from the accomplishment of this game being a solo dev project. You'll notice that none of my complaints were about the bosses. But admittedly for me, I found this game to be quite stressful. And the further I got into the game, the more confused I was as to where I was supposed to go. Regardless of my complaints, the amount of variety in the environment, bosses, and even enemies is staggeringly impressive. There's just certain notes this game had that didn't strike a chord with me.